Today, we're going to talk about Bishop Berkeley. You'll recall from the Locke stuff that empiricism is the idea that knowledge is possible, right? So he does believe knowledge is possible. How do we come to have knowledge? Through the world acting upon our senses. Remember, that's what empiricism is. So obviously, there is this underlying assumption that the exterior, that is material, that the physical world is real, and that it acts on our senses, and that's how we come to have knowledge. Remember, the mind at birth is a blank slate to be acted upon by experience. That's John Locke's sort of the way he lays out the empirical epistemology. Berkeley comes along and says, oh, how cool is that? What's your proof? Right? Why should we think that the world is real? I mean, if the world isn't real, then what point is there in empiricism, right? What point is there to say, oh yes, the world acts upon my senses? Well, let's talk about that world for a second. How do we know that there is a world that acts on our senses? Through our senses? Well, minimally, we can say something like this. When you see somebody from far away, they look really small, right? But you don't say, oh, there's tiny Brandon. Oh, and you know, he's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You say, there's Brandon and he's coming towards me. But what we see is tiny Brandon, right? If I'm far away, then I look really small. Or if we look at the desk, well, from this angle, it looks like a rectangle. But from this angle, it's kind of like, you know, it's kind of at a pointed angle. So if I looked from below, it would look different. So even the information from our senses, if I were to rely on my senses, I would say, here comes tiny Brandon. I wouldn't even say, here comes. I'd say, oh, tiny Brandon is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, right? As I'm walking towards you. So where do we get the idea that Brandon is Brandon, that Brandon is 6 feet tall, period, and he's 6 feet tall even when he's far away, he only looks small because he's so far away. If we were to rely on our senses only, then what we should say is something like, Brandon is really tiny, and he's getting bigger, right? So this idea that there is a single Brandon, right, that has this property, that is 6 feet tall, even though it doesn't look that way, if I were to rely on my senses, I'd have to say tiny Brandon getting bigger. Not Brandon is the same size no matter where he is, and he's coming closer. Where do we get the idea that Brandon is 6 feet tall, even though when he's far away, he looks really tiny? It's a mental act. It happens in the mind. It doesn't happen in our senses, right? And so this notion, Berkeley says, that we can rely on our senses for true information about the world, a little unfair. Because what's really happening there is, at best, we're getting this sensory information, but then the mind combines it into the single whole, right? The 6 foot Brandon, even though he looks really tiny because he's so far away. So if we're careful about the information we get from our senses, we find that it doesn't support that there is an individual Brandon that gets bigger as he comes closer. That is a mental act that we have to do. But we can do better than that. Suppose we were to cut your optic nerve, right, so you didn't see anything. The information about the world that gets into your brain, the visual information, wouldn't get there, right? If the world is real, which Berkeley denies. We're gonna pretend it's real. Even if the world is real, if the information from the world doesn't make it to your brain, or to your mind, and I'm going to ignore the difference for now, but if the information from the world never gets there, then you don't have the sense. That is, you don't have the sense experience. If you're blind, you don't see me, right? And so, because of all that, we can say that sensing, Berkeley points out, that sensing, strictly speaking, happens in the mind. We talk about it happening out there, the real world hits my eyes, whatever, stuff like that. But the reality is, until that information makes it into your mind, you don't have the sensation. So there's a very strong and important sense in which even the things that, the empirical stuff, our very first order senses of things, rely on a mind. No mind, no senses. So all this stuff, all this information about the real world that we're supposed to be sensing according to the empiricists, what does it rest on? Well, ultimately, it's in your head. Because it doesn't make it to your head, you don't have the sensation. So where do we get this notion? That the exterior world is real, that the material world is real? Well, you might want to say we get it from our senses, but until that stuff makes it into our mind, it doesn't exist. So if we're careful, what we have to say is, it's in the mind. Now imagine that, right? That's a big problem for the materialists. That whole metaphysical position, that the world is real, that the physical world exists. All of it, according to Berkeley, is an idea. It has to be in your head. So much for the reality of the physical world. And if you don't believe him, then many of us, kind of don't. Test it out, he says. He says, where do you get any of the information about this material world? Well, it's all through your senses. And I think we have to agree. Maybe not. Maybe you find a way to disagree. I think we probably have to agree that sensation doesn't happen until it happens in the mind. That means that even sensations that are supposed to be sort of the biological response to the physical stimuli of the world, right? The way we sense things, the most basic thing, the most basic experience for the empiricist is really an idea. So all that business about the material world, the Hobbesian stuff, Locke, doesn't matter who, all of it rests on an idea. And he says you can never get past that. Any evidence that you have for the reality of the physical world ultimately rests on a notion in your mind, right? So what is real is what is present before the mind. You say, well, yes, that's the world acting on me. And Berkeley says, well, if we're careful, what we can really say is you're having an experience. But this I'm having an experience of the real world, that's a mental act. That's not something you get from the physical world. Remember Locke's discussion of primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities were those that an object has in itself, regardless of anyone being there to sense it. Number, extension, duration, remember those properties that had to exist in order for us to have the experience? Those were primary qualities. Secondary qualities were an object's ability to produce a sensation in us. And all those secondary qualities, temperature, color, whatever it is, relied on the primary qualities, number, duration, etc. Berkeley says, what's your evidence for those primary qualities? And the best empiricists like Locke and these guys can say is, well, it has to be true because the secondary stuff is true. We do have the experience of these things. So they must exist in order for us to experience them. Berkeley's not willing to go down that road. He says, well, you will conclude that they exist. But that's a mental act. And that is why Berkeley is our great example of idealism. This is a metaphysical position. That is, it is a question about what is real. The alternative was materialism. You will recall materialism, the doctrine there is that what is real is physical stuff, matter, right? The physical world is real. Well, Berkeley says, nuts to the physical world. All your evidence for the physical world happens in your mind, so the best we can do is say there are ideas. So that is the sense in which he is an idealist, right? He's denying the reality of the physical world. Or he's at least saying, it's up to you to prove it, and you can't use anything from your mind to prove it. Good luck, right? So Berkeley's our idealist. You can call him, say, a materialist skeptic. Nothing wrong with that. That's certainly true. And he has a few of these kind of important phrases, where he tells us that strictly speaking, sensing is just thinking. And that's what I was saying before about the world acting on your mind. Unless it acts in the mind, the sensation doesn't happen. So strictly speaking, when you talk about sensation, you're really talking about a mental act. So strictly speaking, sensing is just thinking, and try as you might. There's just nothing you can do to get out of your own head into the reality of the quote-unquote reality of the world around you, right? It's all in your mind. And if you keep that phrase in mind, you'll never go wrong with Berkeley. It's all in your head, right? It's all in your mind. He does try to get us out of this, this dilemma. And I'll share that with you in just a second. I'm not sure what you're going to think of it, but we might say, but Berkeley, I know the world is real because minimally, I have this continuity of experience. Like I know I'm not dreaming. When I dream and I wake up and I say, oh, gee, I thought that was real, but now I realize it's a dream. That's a mental act. Those are things that happen in my head. But in the real world, when I wake up, my wife is next to me. Same wife as yesterday. Looks just the same, smells the same, talks the same. I don't wake up every morning thinking, what is this? What is this, right? I say, that's my toothbrush. I'm gonna brush my teeth now. Or where are my frosted flakes? Or whatever it is. So this idea that there is a continuity within our experience seems to be some evidence that the world, the physical world is real. Because when I see stuff, I recognize it. Obviously a mental act, but the idea that there's this continuity, this sameness, this stability in my experience makes a pretty strong case that that world that I experience is real. To which Berkeley, of course, says, how do you know? Well, the best I could do is to say, I remember it, right? I remember my wife. I have this mental construct, I have this concept, I have this sum of experiences about my wife. And when I look over in the morning, it matches. Well, what do you think Berkeley would say about the continuity of sense experience, or the continuity of experience? The idea that you can rely on your sense experience because it fits with all the things that you remember, right? The classroom looks the same, night looks the same. Like you're watching me now. You're not like, who is this guy? What is a person? I don't know what the hell is going on, right? You say, oh, that's night. Here he is, kind of blah, blah, blah again. I wonder if I can fast forward, if I can get to the end quicker. And of course, if you fast forward, you will get to the end quicker. So what do you think Berkeley's going to say about that? It's actually pretty easy for him. He says, you think that you have a continuity of experience because what you think of as your current sense experience corresponds to what you remember. But come on, where do memories live? Right? A memory is nothing but a mental act, or a mental event, a mental construct. Whatever it is, it takes place in your mind. So do you think that I could trick you into thinking you remember something? I don't know if I could. But I know that if you're a normal person, no offense, that you've probably had the experience of having a dream. And in your dream, you're like, gee, I remember this. But then you wake up, and you hadn't remembered it. You thought you had remembered it, right, while you were in your dream. So the fact that we can have a mental state, call it a memory, right? A memory is a mental state. Berkeley has tried to show us how a sense experience is a mental state. So even if we want to use something like the continuity of experience to buttress, prove, or provide support for the reality of the physical world, doesn't do us any good, because in the end, all we're doing is comparing an idea to another idea. And we're right where Berkeley wants us to be. Yes, idealism. Ideas are real. That's what's real. And if you don't have the idea, then it's not real. It can't happen, right? If it never makes it to consciousness, if it never makes it to your mind, whatever it is, I don't care if it's a sense experience, a hallucination, or a memory, or whatever. If it never makes it to your mind, then there's no sense in which you can say it is real. So, Berkeley was our example of certainly an idealist, a major, major skeptic about the whole project. Hobbes' whole project of trying to reground philosophy on our better sciences and physics, all of the physical sciences, all of the physical world, gone. What's left? Nothing but row, row, row your boat. Life is but a dream. Pretty depressing stuff. And frankly, it may be a little bit difficult to use. So even if that's true, what do I do with it? Berkeley does have an answer. And it relates to that continuity of experience. And while he is hell-bent on saying it's all in your head, he does say that there's a certain symmetry and perfection in our sense experiences and in our memories. And so while they may all be in our head, and we may not be able to say for certain that they're all real, we can proceed with confidence, knowing that the material world is at least real in some extent, because while it may all be in your mind, we are all in the mind of a perfect being. We are all God's hallucinations. And so as long as we are being dreamt, conceived, imagined, whatever your favorite word is, by God, then we're going to have this continuity of experience. So it sort of comes down to, in the end for Berkeley, like, the world isn't real, but we're all in God's dream, and because God is perfect, that we can go ahead and proceed as though this world were real. Not a super exciting conclusion, perhaps, especially for a guy who's been so hardcore about being skeptical about what we can know in the reality of the material world. I do sort of get the feeling at the end where it's like, but it's okay because God is hallucinating all of this, or that rather, we are all ideas in the mind of God. I don't know. Maybe it's fine, and maybe I'm not. Maybe I need to think it through a little bit better. But it just feels a little unsatisfying. After he was so hardcore to knock out all of the reality of the physical world, we sort of had to resurrect it all and bring it back at the last second. So be it. That's Berkeley. We don't water them down or change what they had to say. This is what Berkeley has in mind. So when it comes to the exam, and I'm asking you questions about idealism, remember Berkeley is our number one. I know it's spelled Berkeley, but it's Berkeley. That Berkeley is our number one example of idealism. And what that is a metaphysical position that denies the reality of the physical world. What is real is not matter in the world. What is real are mental acts, mental entities, for lack of a better word. I hope you got all that. It will be on the exam. Berkeley's our major skeptic. He's our idealist. And to keep it all straight, you want to keep comparing him to, say, Locke's empiricism, Hobbes's materialism, so you can keep it straight sort of by distinction with some of these other philosophers. Berkeley will be our great skeptic. And so, of course, in the great question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? For Berkeley, the question is, what tree? Or did the tree even fall? I mean, heck, if no one experienced it, what are you basing that on? All you can really say is, there's a tree on the ground. And frankly, you probably can't even say that. What you can say is, I have the sensation of a tree on the ground, right? Best we can do with Berkeley. Or you could then sort of go full circle and say, yes, there is a sound because the tree fell in the mind of God, and God's mind being perfect would have produced a sound. I guess you can say something like that if you want for Berkeley. That's it for now. I will be talking to you again soon. I hope you guys are doing okay, and we will meet again shortly.